Hello, everyone, and welcome to For Head's Sake, formerly known as Heads Up, the weekly webcast and podcast of the National Headache Foundation. I'm Dr. Lindsay Weitzel, founder of Migraine Nation and chronic daily migraine survivor. Today is our monthly headache news episode with Dr. Tim Smith. Hello, Dr. Smith. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks for
Everyone
having me.
knows, our regulars at least know, that Dr. Smith is a regular on our show because he has extensive experience in migraine clinical trials as the CEO of Study Metrics Research. Dr. Smith is also a board member, of the National Headache Foundation. So he is here to bring us all sorts of wisdom and information on some of the new news that came out this month having to do with headache and migraine. We generally do FDA approvals. We talk about new medical articles that came out, and we do this once every month now that we have become known as For Head's Sake. So today, Dr. Smith, let's start with, there is something really cool that I think everyone's going to love to hear about. We have an exciting new and unique medication trial that has been launched by a US company called Vaccinity. Believe it or not, everyone, they have begun a clinical trial on a vaccine for migraine in humans. So Dr. Smith, please tell us all about this.
Sure. Well, so this is, first of all, it's a phase 1 study. So it's the first in human study that just launched in August, I believe it was. And if people are interested, they can look it up on clinicaltrials.gov. It's listed there. So this is a legitimate, sanctioned study that rolls up under the FDA rules and regulations. So it's bona fide, and we, think that it's being conducted correctly. It's not a study of migraine patients, and that might sound odd to some, but for these phase 1 vaccine studies, they frequently enroll in the first phase just healthy humans without the disease disorder, and what they're looking for is the antibody response to the vaccine. Right. And so there are lots of reasons why they do that, but that's not uncommon. And then so for once they see what the antibody response is to the vaccine, then they'll be able to progress on to the clinical response kinds of studies that will follow in phase 2 and 3, which will lead up to the approval. The other thing is, people will get excited about this because the thought of a vaccine to take away potentially take away a migraine syndrome. It's pretty attractive,
right.
Out with the pills and, take a shot. And hopefully, if you have a long-term response, this could be a really game-changing intervention, maybe, like we've never seen before, just, and whether we'll need boosters or all that kind of stuff, we won't know for a long time. But the study is recruiting. They're only going to put about 40 subjects in the study, 40 patients. And that's pretty typical for this level of a study. They don't need hundreds or thousands of patients to find out what the antibody response curve is going to look like. So the FDA is insistent on not enrolling more patients in a study than is necessary to answer the question at hand. And so that's why it'll be a small study too. So some of these things are just part and parcel of being a phase 1 study. And I don't have my hands on this yet because we don't do phase 1s at my clinic. We do phase 2s and 3s and beyond. But I think it's an interesting concept. It's a complicated thing because if you think about what we're trying to do, researchers are trying to help patients develop antibodies against CGRP. Well, right. CGRP is a natural component of a human being. Human beings have CGRP, right? And so to do this, you're basically, it's trying to invoke an autoimmune response. So what they have to do is and they use peptides, not viruses or things like that. It's a peptide that they inject, and basically trains both T cells and B cells. And those of you that keep up with these vaccines know that they're two different sort of ways the human body activates the immune system to take something out of your circulation. And this goes after both of those aspects, so that at least, scientifically, that should be associated with a better chance of success. But we're trying to train those approaches to go after CGRP molecules in your system. And the trick is to do that without activating the immune system to go after other components in your body. But their design, their concepts are good, and they should be able to induce an antibody and T cell response against CGRP. And if it's strong enough to really make a difference in migraine, then theoretically it should be a really, really good cure, or close to a cure treatment.
So really quick, let's just, so that we can make sure everyone's following. First, they are not at this time in phase 1 enrolling people who have migraine. In fact, if you have migraine, you're not allowed in this trial. So this is not a trial that we can all go out and be in, because they're looking for safety and efficacy. That would have to wait till phase 2. So the second thing is, if you could really quick, just for everyone, explain the difference between what this vaccine that is working with the CGRP pathway, the difference between that and taking one of the monoclonal antibodies that we are so familiar with is. What are the difference between these two things?
That's a great point. So it's basically accomplishing the same end result. But with the CGRP monoclonals, what we're doing is we're cultivating and creating the antibodies externally from the human body and injecting them into the human body. And they have a half-life of about 4 weeks. So they protect for about 4 weeks, and you have to take another shot. With this, you're putting an antigen in the system causing the system to create an antigen that your own system will create antibodies itself. And the human immune system has something doctors call an anamnestic response, which means once it has that allergic response or immune response, I should say, then it keeps that memory, and it's always there. And so it continually will continue to develop antibodies against the molecule. So that's why vaccines are sometimes a one and done, but maybe booster shots every now and then. We won't know what the duration of the effectiveness of it, if there is effectiveness. We won't know what that is until we get to the phase 2s. This phase 1 study is not scheduled to be done until August of 23, is what they're saying in the published accounts on this. So by the time they get there, they'll probably be able to crunch numbers on the antibodies well before then. But then hopefully they'll progress on to phase 2s, and that's when people will be able to volunteer to participate in studies for their migraine. So just keep that in mind, and hopefully next summer or after we'll see it progress. If they do show their antibody response and their T cell response to be adequate.
So basically the goal of this migraine vaccine is to train our bodies to make antibodies against CGRP instead of us injecting antibodies every month. Yeah. Is that a good way to put it?
Yeah, it's a good way to put it. So your native CGRP, it's your immune system doesn't attack it. It's like the sheep, and the vaccine kind of puts wolf's clothing on the sheep, so that your body wants to get rid of the wolves, and the sheeps are cloaked in wolf's clothing, and so you can eradicate it that way. I don't know if that analogy works, but
I got it. I followed it. It sounds good. Okay, so the next interesting thing that has come out since our last episode is a study was carried out that found an association between migraine with aura and atrial fibrillation. The results were just published in Headache, the Journal of Head and Face Pain. And this study was not that simple and straightforward. There was it was kind of complicated the way they did it. So can you tell us about this study and what it means for us?
Right. So the study shows this association with atrial fibrillation, and atrial fibrillation it's basically a disordered, chaotic rhythm of the heart that's most of the time it's very rapid and inefficient, and it can be associated with swelling and edema, shortness of breath, palpitations, fainting, and you can even have heart injury from it. So it's not a good thing to have, but it's not just in and of itself, it's not usually deadly and can be corrected. It's just a matter of detecting it and doing the corrective actions on it. Can be associated with stroke, and maybe we'll have a chance to come back to that. But this study, as you said, was not a straight up study of AFib itself. What these researchers did is they developed an algorithm, a computerized algorithm, what they call a artificial intelligence algorithm, that these are very common now in a lot of these healthcare analyses. They train the computers to do these exercises, and they develop an algorithm for predicting AFib or atrial fibrillation and other disorders for that matter, based on the inputs into their algorithm. And what they do is they go and they take a large database of patients. In this case, it was about 40,000 patients with and without migraine, and they had, with and without aura within the migraine population. And they put all of their EKGs into this machine, and the machine, the computerized algorithm analyzes their EKGs, and they have these risk factors that are highly predictive of AFib in those patients. And what they did is they parsed that population based on whether they had migraine or not, and whether they had migraine with and without aura. So it wasn't a straight up analysis of true cases of AFib. It was analysis of response to a predictive algorithm. And basically what they showed is that there was a higher incidence of a greater risk of AFib, I should say, greater risk of AFib according to the algorithm in the patients with migraine with aura as compared to patients without migraine.
Okay. Now, as many of us are aware, there is a bit of a higher risk of stroke in people with migraine with aura, specifically with aura, than in the general population. And my understanding is AFib can be related to stroke. And this makes me wonder, could this possibly be the reason we have a higher risk of stroke? Did the authors delve into that at all?
Well, that was the hypothesis. That was the whole reason for doing the analysis in the first place, is because we do know that there is that increased risk of stroke. So in migraine patients, there's your risk of stroke lifetime is about twofold increased, and most of that's accounted by patients with migraine with aura.
Right.
Accounted for by patients with migraine with aura. And so if there's an increased incidence or association, I should say, there's an increased association with risk for atrial fibrillation in patients that have migraine with aura. And atrial fibrillation is associated with incidence of stroke. And basically what happens with AFib is the top chambers of the heart don't beat rhythmically. They kind of lose their normal conduction pattern through the the modified electrical muscle fibers in the tissue. And so instead of it conducting an orderly impulse through the heart and leading the heart chambers to contract rhythmically, the upper chambers of the heart, which are the priming pumps for the main pumping chambers of the heart, they don't contract like they're supposed to. They kind of sit there and wiggle like a little bag of worms or something. And that's an inefficient process. And it allows little back eddies of the blood to kind of pool in the appendages of the atria. And when you have blood pooling, it tends to clot. Right. And once you have those clots, some of those are going to break loose and come out through the circulation. They get pumped and they can travel to the brain and cause these little miniature strokes these embolic strokes into the brain with these little tiny blood clots that break loose. So, that's what's going on. That syndrome is associated with stroke. Migraine is with aura is associated with stroke. This study found an association between the risk of atrial fibrillation, according to this algorithm, and patients who have migraine with aura. So if you do the deductive reasoning, you can connect the dots and see how this might be connected. So that's the big point, the big picture of the study. I'll point out that the difference on this between groups was 1.7%. So it's not huge, but it did reach statistical significance. So it's not, we don't ignore it or discount it, but you have to look at the effect size too. And when they controlled for other risk factors for atrial fibrillation, the adjusted risk was 0.7%. So, think about that as 7 in 1,000, if you think of what 0.7 is. So I'm not blowing it off. I think there's substance here, but I don't want people to run out and, think that their stroke is imminent, in the near future. So if your risk of stroke is only 1 in 100,000, if you even double that, it's still only 2 in 100,000. So you're still mostly safe. And I made those numbers up, but I'm just saying it's, it's all in context and perspective. But I think we don't still know what the pathophysiologic connection is, but this is an association that we didn't know about before, and it's very compelling.
I think that's important. We always want to make sure that we talk about effect size, because just because we find something that's significant in these medical studies and these scientific and epidemiological studies does not mean that we need to panic, because a lot of times the effect sizes are pretty small. So thank you for saying that. And also I want to point out that there seems to be a common theme in some of what we found in the literature this last month, and that sort of is there's some things that we can do to take care of ourselves. What might be one of the things when it comes to this AFib data? Can we monitor these things with our latest Apple Watches, Fitbits, or do we need to go in the doctor more often to have our heart listened to? How can we catch something like this?
Yeah, I mean, all those are ways of doing that and having these technologies, because sometimes AFib can be asymptomatic. You don't even know you have it. A lot of people have, palpitations and they feel different, but some people have it and they don't know the difference until they have a stroke, or something like that. So it's a good point to make. And you think about the causes of atrial fibrillation. Well, if you have a heart blockage, or if you're extremely overweight, if you have a thyroid condition, if you have high blood pressure, if you have diabetes, if you have other risk factors for heart damage, you can think of AFib as being one of those things that can be a result of injury to the heart or strain on the heart, as it were. Sleep apnea. I mean, the list goes on. There are a whole lot of risk factors. So I think, ultimately, we think about a lot of those risk factors as being risks for migraine exacerbation too. And I think, and to your point, some of the things we're talking about today, in the end analysis, we're going to come back and say, take good care of yourself and get your health checkups and exercise and keep your weight down and stay hydrated. And, you think about blood clots more easily when you're dehydrated and you're hemoconcentrated. Our migraine patients are chronically dehydrated, especially if they have severe migraine and they're vomiting a lot. They don't adequately replace their fluids. I mean, the narrative goes on, and I don't want to overstate it, but, the best take home from this is if you have migraine, self-nurture, take care of yourself, take care of yourself first. Most of us don't do that. We take care of everybody else. And we don't take care of ourselves. It's a migraine trait. Trust me, I've seen it so many times.
Okay, so the next couple studies we're going to talk about are actually related to COVID-19. Our last news episode from last month, we discussed a study that found that COVID-19 triggered headache in about half of patients, and that it could persist sometimes, triggering NDPH, or new daily persistent headache. in a small percentage of those people. So this month, some very interesting data was published related to headache and COVID-19, and it might seem a bit strange to some people. This study actually found that it might be a good thing if you experienced headache as a symptom of COVID. So can you explain that to us?
Yeah, so I don't know if this is a silver lining or not, but we don't have very many
Yeah.
as migraine patients. But this study was sort of interesting. Again, it wasn't a bona fide, bona fide. It wasn't a prospective study. It wasn't a
Right.
trial. What they did was they did a pooled analysis of data that they pulled from the literature. And what happened during the COVID pandemic is there were many case series reports or analysis of groups of patients that came out of a lot of different hospital systems and academic research centers. And the authors of this paper pulled, I think it was like 48 different studies that met their criteria, and they were able to pool the data from all of these individuals that were described in the study that had there were COVID patients. Some died, some didn't, and they decided to look at those and see if the presence or absence of headache was predictive of what, or was associated with whether they survived or not. So it was basically a survival, sort of an analysis of risk factors for survival. And what they found was that the survival rate for patients who had complained of headache as part of their COVID syndrome, the survival rate was significantly better than the survival rate of patients who had no mention or did not complain, did not have headache as part of their presenting symptoms. So, the relative risk number, what they call the relative risk, was 1.9. And what that means is that almost the survival rate was almost double for those. So 1.9 is 90% increase. So, if it's 1-to-1, then it's even, but if it's 1.9 to 1, it's a ratio basically, then that means almost twice as many people on a case-by-case basis had survived if they had headache as part of their presenting complaints.
Right. So this is interesting. I always feel like migraine and headache patients are pretty tough. It's like we're cockroaches. You can't kill us. So I always joke that because I don't have another explanation for this. I don't know if you do, but I don't know why that happened, but I thought it was interesting data that everyone would like to hear.
Well, and the authors did kind of put out some hypotheses. One of them was that it could be related to vitamin D levels. They didn't have that as but it was sort of like vitamin D has been floated out as a potential treatment or improves headache, so on and so forth. And maybe these patients with headache, there was some kind of difference. We'll never know. There was the other hypothesis was maybe that the patients who eventually did pass away from COVID, maybe they were sicker and they were on ventilators and they couldn't complain, as much. And I don't want to make light of it, but that sort of makes sense too. If they didn't capture the symptom, maybe the patients weren't able to report it. I kind of thought of another angle on it, and that is that, we think of the migraine brain as being sensitized and we overprime these pain signals. And it could be that patients who developed headache early on could be people that were latent migraine patients or other primary headache disorders, and their headache came to the forefront earlier and caused them to seek care, before, they had other organ failure and they could get to interventions sooner. We do know that from previous papers that have been published that I think it's a majority of patients who had this headache as part of their post-COVID syndrome were either migraine patients or patients with other primary headache disorders. So these may be people who have headache, issues, and this was a really bad one. And it caused them to seek care before they, got into more, medical trouble. And that was a problem. But that was just my made up thing. It's anybody's guess, but it was, as you said, we have migraine patients survive. I mean, it has to be some evolutionary or other
Yeah,
phylogenetic advantage, or, we would have played out a long time ago. And
right,
my
right.
friend Roger Cady said it one time, his sort of analysis was, maybe in the caveman days, the migraine patients had an advantage because if the tribe was being surrounded by saber-toothed tigers, it was really stressful. The migraine patients went through to the very back of the cave in the darkest, quietest place, and didn't get gobbled up by the saber-toothed tigers. So I don't know if that,
Yes,
whatever it
exactly,
is,
exactly.
kind of fun to think about, though.
Yeah. So while we're on the topic of COVID, there was another study that was just reported, and they looked at headache patterns related to the different types of COVID vaccines. I think everyone's going to love to hear this because I feel like being bombarded, whether it's online or in the Migraine Nation group, etc., with questions about or reports of people talking about how they had a headache pattern triggered by a vaccine. So can you tell us what they found? Were there certain vaccines that were more likely to flare a headache disorder, et cetera?
Yeah. Yeah, this was another association study. It was very interesting, though, because, and I think it came out of the fact that, headache is reported as a side effect or a reaction to some of the, COVID vaccines, and it's quite prominent. And we certainly had to deal with that, a lot of that, and still do, with the COVID-19 pandemic. But this study was an online survey, and they looked at patients with headache and without, and they looked at it with migraine versus the non-migraine patients, and they also sort of divided them out according to the type of vaccine that they had, and looked at the incidence of headache as a complaint in their vaccine reaction.
Mm-hmm.
And the numbers, as it turned out, and I have them before me, was that if patients took the adenovirus vector type, which is the J&J vaccine,
Johnson & Johnson. Okay.
Johnson & Johnson vaccine,
Mm-hmm.
their incidence of headache complaint as a vaccine reaction was almost 54%, 53.6%. If you look at the mRNA vaccines, which would be the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, their incidence was 48%, so 57 versus 48. And then the inactivated COVID vaccine, which they took, this is the Novavax vaccine, and there may be another brand internationally, but in the US, Novavax was only given emergency use authorization earlier this year.
Mm-hmm.
So this being an international study, they had contributions from all three different subtypes. But the inactivated Novavax, basically, vaccine, their result was just short of 35%. So if you think about 54 for the Johnson & Johnson, 48% for Moderna and Pfizer, and then 35% for the Novavax vaccine. Now, again, this is just responses on an online survey. There could be recall bias. There are lots of criticisms of this kind of study, and we may not be able to generalize it. But I think it's food for thought, and it's something that people would be interested in hearing. And I think folks can use that in their decision making on, what kind of vaccine they want to get.
Right.
If they're not vaccinated yet, or if they're going to get boosters, and so on and so
Right.
forth. Or perhaps if they had a bad reaction to J&J, maybe they, and the government has condoned switching, versions. Early in the day, they said if you start Pfizer, stay Pfizer, and so on and so forth. So it's worth thinking about. Let's just put it that way.
Right. I think that for people listening, I think it can make you feel better to know that no, it probably wasn't just in your head. If you got a flare of your headache disorder after the vaccine, you're not alone. A lot of people reported this, and it seems to be the people with Johnson & Johnson that reported it the most. So I think a lot of people, it makes them feel better when they're validated with some data that comes out like that. let's see, let's move on to, there is a study, this is following that thread of, we've got a lot of data that this episode about taking care of ourselves, et cetera. There was some physical activity and migraine data that came out. And this is a conundrum of a topic to me, because we still have, as part of our definition, the official medical definition of migraine, I believe, still states that it is a headache exacerbated by exercise, yet we are told to exercise and that it may help us. So it can be a very confusing topic. But some data came out in the last few weeks related to migraine and exercise. Can you tell me what this latest study said?
Sure. And so this was a study out of Brazil, and they have this longitudinal study of adult health that's going on there, sort of like, I think it's kind of like the American equivalent of the NHANES study, if people know about that. It's they track these patients over time, and they fill out questionnaires and about their health habits and their health outcomes and their medical complaints and medications and so on and so forth. And they get very into depth into diet and physical activities and those kinds of things. And so this study did an analysis looking at levels of physical activity and whether or not it would be associated with migraine or migraine subtypes. And in terms of just basically an association, just a statistical association. So they just looked at these people that described their levels of physical activity, and then they also looked at whether they had migraine and whether they had a migraine subtype, and whether there was an association statistically with their levels of activity. And there were some differences. So basically I summarize with three things. If people had sort of leisure time physical activity, which is what it sounds like, increased physical activity, people who do just sort of general exercise, this would be walking or light jogging or riding your bike with your kids or walking your dog or those kinds of things. People who did that regularly were associated, they had a lower association or lower odds of being a patient with migraine with aura. It didn't separate to the without aura group, but for migraine with aura, there was that association with leisure time physical activity. If patients are citizens, I guess, of Brazil, they weren't patients necessarily, but if they had a history, if they engaged in vigorous physical activity, this population was associated with diminished odds of migraine without aura. So leisure time activity, decreased migraine with aura, vigorous physical activity, decreased odds of migraine without aura. And we could go on all day about the differences on that and what it could be. We're left to guess because the study doesn't answer those questions. But overall, the third point I would make is that just any level of increased physical activity in the general population was associated with the diminished odds of having daily migraine attacks. So there were fewer people who had, now was, which came first, the chicken or the egg, right? Are these people not exercising because they have daily headache? Or does their daily exercise or whatever prevent them from having? We won't know, but it does sort of confirm these associations, which I think we all find interesting, and it's sort of a compelling review of these associations. We advise our migraine patients to exercise, and many of them say, I can't exercise when I'm on a migraine. And we understand that. We wouldn't want you to put yourself in harm's way, but if there's a way for you to increase your physical activity interictally or between attacks, we think that's good for obviously it's good for your general health, and things that are good for your general health are good for your migraine. And as you said, the bottom line is we have to figure out ways to, take care of ourselves and to self-nurture, and exercise is one of those things.
So I believe there was a statement in that paper that the more vigorous exercise was associated with helping prevent migraine without aura. Was that true?
Yeah, careful how you say that.
I think I might not be saying it great. Sorry.
It didn't prevent migraine with aura, it was associated with diminished. You see,
Diminished
this is the
incidence.
researcher in me coming out. It's like, you
Yeah.
know, you
Lower
have these
incidence. Yeah.
associations. It's very, you have to be careful attributing cause,
Right.
causality to the correlation. So having vigorous exercise correlates with the population that has a diminished incidence or diminished risk of migraine without aura, but not for migraine with aura, just migraine without aura. Did you have a thought on that, or what were you thinking?
I did. That stood out to me because I think a lot of our audience knows I've spoke about it before, that I am one of those people, and there's people all over the spectrum. Some people I know, because I work with them, can barely raise their heart rate without triggering a migraine. And then I'm on the other end of the spectrum. If I don't exercise every day, I have a much worse migraine by the afternoon. But I have personally found that since I get a little bit of both, I get some migraine with aura and some without, it's harder to exercise if you've got a migraine with aura coming on, I believe. And so that was something that stood out to me. It made me wonder if that's because the people who experience migraine without aura are able to exercise more vigorously. And so I would find it interesting if someone studied that topic more. Keep my eye out for more data to bring to everyone about that. I think that would be an interesting topic.
Yeah.
So we have one more thing to talk about, and it's one of my favorite topics, and it has to do with cognitive impairment. I think so many of us with migraine complain of brain fog and issues with cognitive impairment, but it seems like we are always told that the data only shows transient cognitive impairment issues in people with migraine, nothing that sticks around really much interictally between migraine episodes or long-term as we get older. But this data was a little bit different. I don't want to get anyone really worried, but Dr. Smith, what did this particular study that just came out, what was it saying about long-term cognitive impairment in people with migraine?
Well, so this is another meta-analysis. This is not a primary investigation. We look at these a lot, and they're legitimate. We can believe the results on them. But I think the conundrum was that got these researchers to look at this was that there's just such a mixed batch of results for different. One investigator reports no loss in cognitive function in migraine patients, and others report that there is. We do know that there is believable data. There are believable data, showing that during a migraine attack, our cognition is not good.
Right.
That's kind of totally understandable. We get that. There are other studies that show that actually even prodromally and postdromally in the recovery phase, when things are not just right with your brain, that even though you don't have pain, that you can still have some cognitive misses on that. That's not surprising either. What this study did is they did a meta-analysis of a lot of studies. They decided to just pool all that data together, kind of try to cut to the chase and see if there was a preponderance one way or the other. And they did show that there was a decrease in general cognitive functioning and in language functioning in migraine population as opposed to people without migraine, without a population without migraine. So you can right away start thinking about what the difference is. And, over the long haul, some of these patients were studied during a migraine attack, undoubtedly. Unless there's some other risk factor that makes people without migraine have a cognitive decline, then it's not surprising there would be a decrease. But it's a cause for concern because nobody wants to be associated with a cognitive impairment, as a result of an illness, but especially an illness that doesn't go away, a disease that you're basically stuck with. So the presumption right away is, well, if we can't get rid of our migraine syndrome, then we can't get rid of our dementia risk or our cognitive decline risk. And I wouldn't jump to that conclusion from this study. but and the results did show that performance on cognitive testing decreased by about 40%, and for language function by about 15%.
Wow.
But the authors went on to say that there was no significant difference between visual spatial function, attention, executive function, and memory. So,
Right.
that this doesn't sound like, sort of Alzheimer's or dementia developing
Right.
here. So I wouldn't take it to heart, I guess. And ultimately, we're going to come back to what we've been saying this whole episode. You're take care of yourself, diminish your risks of dementia. We know what those are. Keep your body weight down, keep your blood sugar normal, keep your blood pressure controlled, keep your cholesterol down, make sure you're exercising, make sure you stay adequately hydrated, make sure you're getting enough rest,
Right.
make sure you're dealing with your stress adequately. So these are all things that we know are good for us, and
Right.
they're good for our migraines, and they're good for our health outcomes. So,
Right.
maybe some of this is not a total shock or surprise. And it just underscores to me, once again, what we've been saying throughout this episode is, do the self-nurturing, put in the work, take care of yourself. You've only got one you, and, make the most of it.
Yeah, it comes back to, I say so often, you sort of have to be a superhero at certain things. When you have migraine disorder, the mentality thing is the biggest thing. You have to practice such good mental hygiene in order to stay healthy, because migraine's always trying to get at you. But you also have to take care of yourself physically, because some of these things, the data will come out and it might show that we're at increased risk of certain things, but just take care of you, I think, is the bottom line. So I'm really glad that you said that, and I like the way you said it, and I'm so grateful that you are here with us today. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close?
I think we've addressed the topics pretty well, and I think it was a good episode. So I'm happy to be on. I thank you for having me on again. Look forward to next time.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us today on this week's episode of For Head's Sake. Please join us again next week on the weekly podcast and webcast of the National Headache Foundation. And don't forget that we are audio too, wherever you like to listen to your podcast. So you can watch us or just listen. Thanks again. And thank you, Dr. Smith. Everyone have a great day.